what I will continue to say is also, like, obviously the SABS process has been really, really handy. So, you know, the SABS legislation is really useful because it looks not only at water quality and attenuation, but it also looks at biodiversity amenity as well. And so when you start to say, well, actually a green roof might be the best way within the red line in a city centre development to actually get to meet the SABS and the SUDS standard requirements, and then you can sort of chuck in the biodiversity bit. And we do have SPG on biodiversity, which really helps from a planning point of view. But then when you chuck in the amenity value and the biodiversity value, it becomes very clear that a cedar mat is not going to give us what we want. And so therefore you can start to look at extensive biodiverse green roofs or intensive green roofs. And so every development is unique. I think the other thing I've really found with the green space factor tool is that when developers first used it, possibly they were a bit frightened by it because they're a bit worried about, would it be easy to do, would it require too much, would it be too would it be cost efficient? And the feedback that we have had, and this obviously isn't scientific, but sort of the feedback that we have had is that once they've used the tool once, it actually is quite easy to use. And if you follow the principles of GI, it is quite easy to achieve. And if you want to keep the costs low, you just need to design it in right from the beginning to keep the costs as low as possible. Otherwise, it's obviously, like everything, it's more expensive if you try to engineer it in at the end.
That's really interesting to hear how our sustainable drainage legislation kind of works in synergy with your biodiversity supplementary planning guide, which I'm guessing, well, certainly the SUDS legislation is statutory in Wales. And I'm saying this because we're fortunate enough to have Jane Houghton from Natural England joining us today. And your biodiversity supplementary guidance, I'm guessing, is a material consideration for planning.
It is.
So developers have to take account of that.
And the next LDP will have a GI supplementary planning guide as well.
Yeah, the intention is that we'll have, because that's one of the things we have also learned from this process is that without supplementary planning guidance, there is a bit of a gap. So just using the strategy, there is a bit of a gap on how you really score for quality in terms of these techniques. And I think that's partly also because it has become so trendy. And so we are seeing that people coming in with a bit of green bling and not the real thing. And so having something like supplementary planning guidance is something that will give us that sort of certainty that we're getting high quality, which obviously delivers most in terms of nature and well-being for the city. So that is something that, you know, will come out of the next LDP process.
Fascinating. Now, I'm wondering if I put Jane on the spot, Jane Houghton, and ask her if there's any kind of compare and contrast with some of the experiences you've had in England, where, particularly around sustainable drainage systems, the legislation is very different to Wales.
Yeah, thanks, Pete, and good to see you. And thanks very much for extending the invitation to enable us to join. I forwarded it to colleagues and will feed back to them. So in England, we don't have a mandatory requirement for sustainable drainage. As you probably know, I think it's Schedule 10 is being looked at in terms of and reviewed in terms of bringing in mandatory requirement for sustainable drainage to be incorporated into development. Schedule 3, sorry. But we have included sustainable drainage as within the green infrastructure framework as a principle, and acknowledge, promote the benefits. So obviously it plays a key and important role in application of our urban greening factor. And we have also set targets around the urban greening factor for residential, commercial and greenfield development. So I think that in England, we're taking a advisory, good practice approach to sustainable drainage, and it's an area that we want to do more work on, so that as government considers a mandatory role for sustainable drainage, we sort of integrate good practice green infrastructure within that. So we're gathering different examples of good practice. So it's fantastic to see your examples in Swansea, really inspiring the range of different options and that building. And I was just, we run a green infrastructure specialist network for Natural England, DEFRA and others, and we'd be really delighted if you'd like to come and talk to that network, if you can spare the time to talk about your work. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks, Jane. I realised I put you right on the spot there, and you came through magnificently.
Well, I hope that helps. Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Oh, excuse me, Penny.
Yeah, I was just going to add. I mean, I don't think Fran and I can take all the credit for what's happened in Swansea, because I think there's been a really strong biodiversity interest and environmental movement in Swansea for a very long time. But I also think as well, we were quite fortuitous in sort of where we are in terms of knowledge around climate change and the emergency. And, I remember actually during COVID thinking, what impact might this have on green infrastructure and where we're trying to go with it and how society might change as we come out of this. And I think, again, these things, this learning that we've gone through as sort of globally as well as locally in Wales has sort of helped us and helped raise awareness around the impacts of climate change and the need for nature recovery, and how green infrastructure is such a large sort of part of that. So I think there's an element of timing as well that has been quite useful. And I think another thing that I'm becoming more aware of is, when I started at the council 20 years ago, and I used to go out to schools and do eco schools with kids and talk to them about the environment, etc., is that portion of society is obviously now grown up and is now the people that are moving into jobs, etc. And I think there's sort of a different cultural change coming in as well. So I think there's a lot of things that are happening that has helped us to achieve what we've achieved in the last 5 years.
And I think whilst legislation is really, really useful, and we've used it to we've used it as a hook for an awful lot of things, it does pose some challenges sometimes. Like there's been some unintended consequences with the SUD stuff. We've made some things a numbers game. Some things are not considered sustainable drainage if they don't meet the standards. We didn't invent SUDs in Wales. It's a philosophy around how we hold on to water and use nature to do it and clean it and all that stuff. So I think there are some really interesting things that I think we're learning through that journey. And our SABS officers and planners have told us that they've sort of been siloed from each other. So developers are sort of playing one off the other. We don't need to put water into planning because it goes to the SABS. And, so we're seeing some really interesting things around that. And that's really useful for us because we've continued with our relationships with everybody. We're able to pick that stuff up and say, okay, well, how do we address that in a county-wide strategy or in the SPG and in the LDP? How do we bring that back together? How do we support engineers who've been given SUDs also work with those people who are already professionals in designing places for people and nature, landscape architects, and making sure that comes together. So yeah.
And I guess that's the thing when you're dealing with really sort of quite avant-garde legislation, which, fair play, I'm very grateful the Welsh the Senedd have looked to do that, but there will always, there are always little sort of tweaks, aren't there, that need to be made, and it's only when you actually try and do it in practice that you understand what those tweaks are. And as I said, with planning, there can be a lag because you're dealing with planning applications that precede or supersede, I can't remember which way around it is, there's the legislation coming in. So you need to sort of you're sort of for a while, you're sort of nearly running two different sort of races, aren't you? And so it's interesting to see how those play out and what we can learn as they are playing out to improve them for everybody.
Could I come back?
Fascinating. Jane, yes.
Yeah, thank you. It's really interesting to hear your experience and your reflections on, using the green space factor, but also sort of that longer history. And, I think it's really exciting that Wales, England and Scotland are all now working together on nature towns and cities, the joint initiative with the National Trust Heritage Lottery Fund and the different devolved nations. And, that's offering us a fantastic opportunity to share the learning across the nations, and to bring it to those nature towns and cities participants and people who are working towards accreditation. So yeah, I look forward to perhaps having further conversations about this and how we can capture what you've done to make it more widely available within that setting.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely. Very happy to.
Thanks.
Great, brilliant, wonderful. Thank you.
Now, I've got a question about retrofit of green infrastructure, but I'm conscious there's a bunch of other people on this call, and I just wondered if anybody else had any questions before I butt in, because we're rapidly running out of time. In that case, while people are thinking about it, yeah, retrofit of particularly sustainable drainage systems. How's that going? I mean, we've talked a lot about stuff being put onto stuff which requires planning permission because it's a new development. But you know, what's happening in terms of people coming to you and saying, "I'd like to put a suds in. Can you help?"
So sustainable drainage has definitely been the sort of longer journey out of all the typologies that we're, you know, to use that as a word catch-all term. And we've worked really closely with the highways team to kind of get to a place where, and that's the Burrows Road example that we just showed you.
It was a pilot. It was a test.
Yeah, that was I mean, in a way, it's not a pilot because we know that the process works, but it was a pilot for us in Swansea for everybody to understand how we go through that journey of doing it. And you can never underestimate your window shops. You know, have a window shop where people, and we found this, and I always find it really interesting. Human beings are so fascinating, aren't we? We used to use examples early on in presentations, and they were of London and Germany and other places. And people say, well, we're not mainland Europe. It's like, okay, well, here's one in London. Oh, we're not London. Okay, what about Bristol? We're not Bristol. Cardiff? Oh, no, we're still pushing it. Okay. So we just need to have our own. So some pushback on those things is really useful, and doing that through good relationships and good communications at all tiers within organizations is a really good way of doing it. But actually, sometimes you've just got to go pick a site and say, okay, this might not have been the site we would have chosen. Where would you like to choose? Where are you happy to let us play? And let's figure out how we do this together, and then test how we maintain it. So that's been a journey. It's a big pilot for the parks team around, this is the maintenance plan. Can we sustain this maintenance plan? Because, I mean, you've got Grangetown behind you, and we know that some of those, you know, some of them are starting to look a little unloved. So we need to have schemes that we're thinking about how they're designed for the long-term maintenance. And bringing in community stewardship is really important, but they're still going to need to be hand weeded, and they're still going to need the silt removed from the silt trap and all that kind of stuff. So that's been a real journey. So we've completed that one at Burrows Road. We've currently got, and it's almost finished, really amazing. So we'll definitely share information on this, but it's outside St. Helens Primary School, again in Sandfield, so it's just up from Burrows Road. And that was another partnership between Swansea Council and NRW. We also brought in Urban Foundry. They use Waits Enterprise, the Waits Enterprise Family Trust, to fund community engagement, where they went out and talked and did door-to-door knocking. They did a community event. So that kind of took it out of our hands in a way of, this is what we're trying to do. You go out to the community. They said this. We also worked with Bray Associates on that one. They went into the school and did a rainscape, you know, got the children in year 5 to design a rainscape. They're now in year 6. And we're at a stage now where we're just organising school community planting days, so they can be involved in that process as well. So it's step by step, and we want to feed back to them. You know, this isn't, you don't just do something in a community and that's it, you're done. So that's a really interesting one, because it's part of an active travel scheme. So there's actually kind of 3 distinct sites on that which are using Rainscape principles. And then just yesterday we were having a conversation about another couple of sites. So it's,
I think, going back to the question that the gentleman from NRW asked right at the beginning, sure, the strategy is really, really important. So what we actually did is how the bioretention rain gardens in Sandfield started was Highways actually approached us and said, we have real flooding issues in this particular place, because obviously we've got the bottom of the hill from the so you've got a lot of surface water runoff coming down. You've got Victorian terraces. There's not a lot of front gardens. It's quite a sort of a traditional area. And then to top it all off, it's literally 200 meters from the sea, from Swansea Bay.
Some of it
So
below sea level.
what you've actually got is you've got water coming down the hill, you've got the flat bit before the beach, and you potentially got, with neap tides, water coming up the hill.
Super springs.
Springs. Sorry, I always get my tides around the wrong way. Super springs. And then on top of that, so you've got a massive water quality potential going on. You've got flooding issues going on. Then you've got a lot of wind-blown sand, which, if you've ever been to Swansea on a windy day, can be a problem around Swansea Bay. And so what we actually started off with is we started off with a blue-green audit of the Sandfields area. And that blue-green audit mainly focused around bioretention rain gardens in the highway as the ways of dealing with those problems. We also obviously brought into that lack of nature, because there's not a lot of green space in there, and also urban cooling, etc., and the use of sort of green infrastructure to help with that, as well as amenity. And so what we did is we did this audit, and we then designed a couple of feasibility studies. So the audit makes a feasibility study, and we had a couple of concept designs which included Burrows Road. And as Fran said, we did that first as a poke and product test for the council and the community, etc. And then the other schemes are now coming from that. So there was quite a structured approach behind it that came out of a need identified by the highways team and the solutions that we could provide using green infrastructure. So that's the sort of background behind it. So retrofitting is harder. I think it's harder for in the ground retrofitting than it might be for green roofs, because green roofs tend to be easier to retrofit to existing buildings. But I think it depends upon your typology. Walls can be easier to retrofit. I think for us, in my experience so far, the most complicated has been going into the highways, because of the range of services that are there, because of the way that they're used, because of the importance to the community, etc. So that's been one of the more complicated ones. But as we said, we've got one under our belts that we can all poke and prod, and we've learned from that. And we're now in the process of doing sort of 3 others, and we'll see where we go from there. And, there is obviously, once you've got an idea of how you do them and you work with companies like Bray, for example, you can then look at where you can put them into other parts of the city, which is what I guess we're looking at from a sort of a cumulative impact point of view in terms of flooding. I think also as well, others learn as well. So one of the things that we learned about doing it right by the sand is that in actual fact, our infiltration rates are really, really good. And so, working
take out
with
some
Bray,
of the stuff that we would have put in traditionally.
Yeah, and working with Bray, they've learned from that process as well, because I'm guessing it's one of the first ones they've done where they're literally within a meter going into sort of a sandy substrate. So that's been really interesting as well. Is that it's been a little bit, we've been testing something which is probably quite relevant for a lot of towns around the sort of the Welsh coastline.
We look at a phenomenal amount as well with the contractors. So the Burrows Road rain garden, I mean, we joke about it being the most surveilled rain garden ever installed. So Penny and I would go down there with a tape measure and be like, oh, this is supposed to be a meter depth, and it's actually 89. So, and that matters, because had they just been allowed to fill it with the different layers, we would have ended up with a lot less soil. And then if the tree failed, it would have been like, oh, well, it's not worked, has it? Well, actually, because we didn't have enough soil for the tree to grow in. So we've learned a lot through that process of
why engineering is important.
Yeah, and how we need to make sure we're quality controlling the civils just as much as we are the planting stuff. And that's been quite interesting.
And it was new to everybody. That's why I call it the pilot, because it was new to everybody. The contractors hadn't done it before. So they, so when I was like saying, well, actually the drawing says 20 mil of small stone chippings up to 5 mil, you need to do that. Now, normally there's a lot more give in those sort of projects, because it doesn't matter if it's 15 mil or it doesn't make, but it's because we're specifically engineering something which is about capacity and filtration rates. It's actually really important that you do exactly what has been designed. And I think that was a learning curve for all of us. Especially me, like literally there with a ruler with Fran going, well, I don't think this is right. I've never been involved in a highways project ever before in my life.
It was,
it was great. It was good.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me with SUDS how many people forget the water flows downhill, and that it won't flow uphill no matter how nice the thing looks.
Absolutely. Yeah, little things like making sure sort of the overflow is
below. We've got a really funny, we should put that in a presentation actually. We've got a really funny picture of Penny looking down an overflow that's a metre above ground level. So for that overflow, and the reason the rain garden has an overflow is because there was a gully there originally. It should at least do the basic function of what was there originally should the rain garden fail.
Yeah.
It's on sound. A metre depth, the whole of Sandfield and Oystermouth Road and the city would have been underwater at that point.
And that overflow is not going to solve it.
Yeah.
but again, that was because it was designed, and this is a perfect example that I've learned. Yeah. It was designed for when we thought that the gully was going to be lower. Yeah. And of course, when you go into the ground, as everybody's told me, and I now fully understand, things are not where they think they are, because there might not be the records because they go so far back. And so the contractors did what they took the item that had been made and they attached it to where they had to attach it. But of course, the contractors didn't know that the whole purpose. I mean, it looked a bit like a telescope rather than. But we all learn from that. And so my learning from that is actually when the contractors started on the work, I should have spent time with them explaining to them what we were designing and why, and then they would have put it on there and gone, well, that's not right. But of course they didn't. So
and plants,
you learn.
Plants ended up, because obviously it's designed to work as a nice little bit of landscape. Plants were put in the wrong place, even though we stood there. I mean, you and I stood there, went through the planting schedule with the guys who were putting it in, and then he got in his van and drove off, and the other people put all the plants out and dug them in the ground, and we turned up later on and went, these are all in the wrong place. So that's been a real journey of, this year we actually dug up a lot and moved things, and we've put some things in where things had struggled, because by the time it was finished, you don't want to plant in June, but we did. So we had to water it. Some things struggled more than others. So
it's all learning.
Yeah, and a bit of the broken window policy. If it's broken, fix it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, look, it's just past 11 o'clock, and I just wanted to say, Penny, Fran, thank you so much. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And it's going to go on YouTube, so it's going to be a resource which people can draw on for ages to come. So thank you so much indeed for coming along and presenting at the webinar. Thank you so much for your time.
People are welcome to get in touch with us if they want to ask us questions.
Thanks once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And look at all the great comments in the chat. Yeah, people really enjoyed it today.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.